The snow sample that changed everything arrived at my laboratory in Cambridge on a gray November morning in 1983. It came in a battered thermal container packed with dry ice, accompanied by a telegram from a colleague in Kathmandu. Found at 24,000 feet. Stop analysis shows impossible properties. Stop your expertise needed. Stop. My name is Dr. David Richardson, and I'm a British glaciologist who spent 15 years studying snow crystallography and ice formation in extreme environments. I've analyzed samples from Greenland, from the Antarctic Peninsula, from the highest peaks in the Alps. I thought I understood the physics of frozen water as well as anyone alive. I was catastrophically wrong. The sample looked unremarkable at first. Typical high-altitude neve, white and crystalline, exactly what you'd expect from the death zone of a Himalayan peak. But when I placed it under my electron microscope, when I began the molecular analysis that should have been routine, that's when my carefully ordered understanding of physics began to collapse. The crystalline structure was wrong, not slightly unusual, not within natural variation, but fundamentally impossible. The hydrogen bonding patterns defied every principle I'd been taught, violated basic laws of molecular organization, exhibited properties that shouldn't exist in simple H2O molecules. I thought my equipment was malfunctioning. Spent 3 days recalibrating instruments, preparing new samples, running control tests with ordinary snow. Everything worked perfectly, except when I analyzed the Himalayan sample. Then the laws of physics seemed to take a holiday, and there was something else. Something that made me question my sanity, that made me wonder if the stress of recent months, my divorce, my daughter's illness, the funding cuts threatening my research, had finally broken something essential in my mind. The snow appeared to be alive, not metaphorically, not in some poetic sense, but literally exhibiting behaviors associated with living systems. Under observation, the crystalline structure reorganized itself, adapted, responded to stimuli in ways that inert matter simply couldn't. I ran every test I could think of. Spectroscopy showed anomalous signatures. Thermal analysis revealed energy patterns inconsistent with normal ice. Even basic density measurements came back wrong. The sample was simultaneously heavier and lighter than it should be, as if it existed partially outside normal space-time. What this scientist discovers about the snow will challenge everything we think we know about the Yeti and the mountains themselves. Subscribe now. This revelation will shock you to your core. For 2 weeks, I worked in isolation, telling no one what I'd found, knowing that presenting this data would make me a laughingstock or worse. In 1983, suggesting that snow could exhibit lifelike properties, that molecular structures could violate fundamental physics, that something existing on Himalayan peaks challenged our understanding of matter itself. That was career suicide. But I couldn't let it go. Couldn't dismiss the data just because it was impossible. Every instinct I possessed as a scientist, every training in empirical observation and evidence-based reasoning, told me that what I was seeing was real, however inexplicable. So I did something I'd never done before. I booked a flight to Kathmandu, packed my portable analysis equipment into battered cases, and prepared to go to the mountains myself. Not to collect more samples, I had plenty of sample, but to find the source, to understand the context, to discover what these impossible properties meant in the place where they originated. My colleagues thought I was having a breakdown. My department head strongly suggested I take a leave of absence, get counseling, recover from whatever stress had made me abandon rational thought. I arrived in Kathmandu in early December 1983, carrying equipment that drew curious stares from airport security and explanations that sounded absurd even to me. I'm here to study snow. In a country where people climb the world's highest peaks for glory or enlightenment or the simple challenge of it, coming to study snow seemed either charmingly naive or suspiciously evasive. My contact was Dr. Rajesh Kumar, an Indian climatologist I'd met at a conference in Geneva 5 years earlier. He'd been the one to send the sample, along with cryptic notes suggesting he'd found something that defied explanation. When I met him at a tea house in the Mall, I barely recognized him. He'd lost weight, developed a nervous habit of glancing over his shoulder, and his eyes held the haunted quality of someone who'd seen something that challenged their grip on reality. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I thought perhaps you'd dismiss my findings as equipment error or contamination." "I thought the same thing," I admitted. "Spent 2 weeks trying to prove the data wrong. Couldn't do it. Whatever you found up there, it's real. And it's impossible." Rajesh leaned forward, voice dropping to barely above whisper despite the crowded tea house. "It's not just the snow, David. There are patterns, behaviors. The snow in that region exhibits organization that suggests." He paused, clearly struggling with how to articulate something that sounded insane. "That suggests intelligence. Distributed intelligence, like a neural network, but made of ice crystals instead of neurons." I stared at him, coffee forgotten. "You're saying the snow is conscious?" "I'm saying the data suggests organization and responsiveness beyond what any known physical or chemical process can explain. Whether that constitutes consciousness." He shrugged helplessly. "I don't have the conceptual framework to answer that question." Neither did I, but I knew someone who might. Over the next 3 days, Rajesh introduced me to people who existed on the fringes of both Nepali society and Western rationality. Sherpa elders who spoke of the mountains as living entities, Buddhist monks who described snow as one manifestation of universal consciousness, and Western climbers turned mystics who'd spent too long at altitude and come back changed in ways they couldn't articulate. Every conversation pointed in the same direction. The snow at extreme altitudes wasn't what we thought it was. It was older, stranger, and in some undefined way aware. And it was connected to the Yeti. The accounts varied in details but converged on essentials. The creatures called Yeti weren't animals in any conventional sense. They were something else, something that existed at the boundary between matter and energy, between physical and something else. And they were intimately connected to the snow itself, perhaps even manifestations of it. Consciousness taking temporary physical form from the living crystalline matrix that covered the highest peaks. It sounded like mystical nonsense, like altitude-induced hallucination translated into legend. Except the data on my laboratory bench in Cambridge said otherwise. The molecular structures I documented weren't mystical. They were real, measurable, subject to analysis even if they defied explanation. On the 4th day, Rajesh took me to meet someone different. Not a mystic or a Sherpa elder, but a biologist from Oxford who'd been in Nepal for 6 months and had, according to Rajesh, seen things that have made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the nature of life. Dr. Martin Webb was 45, lean from months at altitude, with the intense focus of someone pursuing an obsession. He met us in a rented apartment filled with equipment that looked more suited to a molecular biology lab than mountain research. Microscopes, centrifuges, temperature-controlled storage units humming in the corner. "You analyzed the snow," he said immediately. No preamble, no social niceties. "What did you find?" I told him. Described the impossible crystalline structures, the apparent responsiveness, the way the sample seemed to exhibit properties associated with living systems. He listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from interest to recognition to something that looked like relief. "Then you've confirmed it," he said quietly. "I thought I was going mad. Thought altitude had broken something in my perception. But if you're seeing it too, if your equipment is recording the same anomalies." He trailed off, then seemed to make a decision. "I need to show you something. Something I've kept secret because publishing it would destroy my career and possibly get me institutionalized." He led us to a back room where 3 refrigeration units maintained precise temperatures. Inside the first unit, carefully labeled and stored, were tissue samples that looked almost like biopsy specimens. "These are from a creature I found dead near Everest Base Camp 8 months ago. Cause of death appeared to be a fall, massive trauma, but the body was intact enough for analysis." "What kind of creature?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "The Sherpas called it Yeti." He said it matter-of-factly, without drama or emphasis, stating a fact that should have been impossible but apparently wasn't. 8 feet tall, bipedal, covered in white fur that wasn't fur at all when I analyzed it microscopically. He pulled out photographic slides, arranged them under a light box. I stared at images that showed something that looked like animal tissue, but revealed something far stranger under magnification. The cellular structure was wrong, if you could even call it cellular. What appeared to be individual cells under low magnification proved to be crystalline structures under higher magnification, arranged in ways that mimicked biological tissue, but were fundamentally different. "It's made of snow," I whispered, understanding finally clicking into place. "The Yeti is made of the same anomalous snow you sent me. It's not a creature that lives in the snow. It is the snow, organized into biological form." Webb nodded slowly. "That's my conclusion, though made of doesn't quite capture it. The tissue samples I've taken demonstrate properties of both living organisms and crystalline structures. They metabolize, or something analogous to metabolism. They maintain homeostasis. They respond to stimuli. But they're also demonstrably composed of the same molecular structures you found in the snow sample. As if the snow itself can organize into different forms, from simple crystals to complex pseudo-biological entities." 3 weeks later, I was at 22,000 feet, climbing toward the region where Rajesh had collected the original sample. The expedition was small, just the 3 of us plus 2 Sherpas who'd agreed to guide us despite obvious misgivings about our destination and purpose. The higher we climbed, the more apparent the anomalies became. The snow didn't behave normally, didn't fall or drift or accumulate according to expected patterns. Instead, it seemed to organize itself, creating structures that looked random from a distance but revealed geometric precision up close. Snowdrifts that formed perfect spirals, icicles that grew in mathematically precise patterns, crystalline formations that resembled neural networks more than geological structures. And it was cold. Not just normal high-altitude cold, but a bone-deep, penetrating cold that seemed to bypass our insulated gear and reach directly into our core. As if the cold itself was alive, was aware, was testing us to see if we belonged in this place where matter behaved according to rules we didn't understand. The truth about the Yeti's origin is more shocking than anyone imagined. Stay with us. What's discovered next will redefine everything we think we know about life itself. On the 5th day of climbing, we reached the zone Rajesh had marked on our maps. A vast snowfield at 24,000 feet, exposed to winds that should have swept it clean, but instead had shaped it into patterns that hurt to look at. Geometries that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, that created optical effects suggesting depth and dimension that couldn't physically exist. I set up my portable equipment with hands clumsy from cold and altitude, taking samples systematically, documenting everything with photographs and careful notes. Webb worked alongside me, collecting tissue samples from the snow itself, treating it like biological material because, increasingly, that's what it appeared to be. The data confirmed what we'd suspected. This wasn't normal snow. Every sample showed the same impossible molecular structures, the same responsiveness to observation, the same properties that suggested organization and perhaps even purpose. Then, as the sun set and temperature plummeted toward lethal, we saw them. They emerged from the snow itself, rising like sculptures coming to life, taking form from the crystalline matrix that covered everything. 3 of them, massive and white and utterly silent, moving with fluid grace despite their size. They didn't walk so much as flow, as if their bodies weren't bound by the same physical constraints that governed our own. The Yeti, real, undeniable, standing 30 meters away and regarding us with eyes that held intelligence I couldn't deny. Webb froze, camera dropping from nerveless fingers. Rajesh made a sound that was part prayer, part terror. The Sherpas backed away slowly, hands raised in gestures of respect or supplication. But I stepped forward, because I understood now, in a flash of insight that bypassed rational thought. They weren't animals. They weren't even biological in any conventional sense. They were the snow itself, consciousness manifested in temporary physical form, awareness emerging from the strange quantum properties of the crystalline lattice that covered these mountains. The closest one, the largest, perhaps the eldest, raised one massive hand in a gesture that was clearly communication. Not threat, not greeting, but acknowledgement. Recognition that we'd finally seen, finally understood something of what they were. And in that moment, standing at 24,000 feet in cold that should have killed me, I felt the snow beneath my feet respond. Felt consciousness that was vast and distributed and ancient beyond measure, that existed in every crystal, every drift, every molecule of frozen water that covered the roof of the world. The Yeti weren't creatures that lived in the snow. They were the snow's way of being conscious, of manifesting awareness in forms that could interact with the physical world. They were what happened when the living crystalline matrix learned to organize itself into higher complexity, when it evolved the ability to perceive and act, and perhaps even think. And we, with our equipment and our theories and our certainty that we understood what life was and how it worked, we were children stumbling into a cathedral, tourists gawking at something sacred that we couldn't begin to comprehend. The Yeti watched us for another minute. Then, as silently as they'd appeared, they dissolved. Not dying, not fleeing, but simply releasing form, consciousness flowing back into the undifferentiated snow from which it had temporarily emerged. We stood in the cold and the silence, 3 scientists whose entire understanding of reality had just shattered, trying to process what we'd witnessed, what it meant, what we were supposed to do with knowledge that would sound insane if we tried to share it. That night, huddled in our tents as wind howled outside, we made a pact. We would document everything, would analyze every sample, would try to understand the physics and biology and consciousness of what we'd found. But we wouldn't publish, wouldn't tell the world, because humanity wasn't ready for the truth about the Yeti, about the living snow, about the consciousness that existed in forms we'd never imagined. Not yet, maybe not ever. We spent 3 more weeks in the mountains, collecting samples systematically, documenting the strange properties of the snow, observing from a distance as the Yeti manifested and dissolved according to patterns we couldn't yet understand. Webb discovered that the crystalline structures responded to electromagnetic fields in ways that suggested information processing. The lattice itself was a kind of neural network, with ice crystals functioning like neurons, electrical potentials cascading through the matrix in patterns that resembled thought. Rajesh mapped the distribution of anomalous snow across the Himalayas, discovering that it existed only above certain altitudes, in regions where conditions were extreme enough to stabilize the impossible molecular structures. Below those altitudes, the snow reverted to normal H2O ice. Above them, it became something else. And I documented the phase transitions, the moments when undifferentiated snow organized itself into Yeti form. It wasn't random. It followed patterns, occurred in response to specific conditions that we were beginning to quantify, even if we couldn't explain them. Temperature fluctuations, changes in atmospheric pressure, electromagnetic variations during storms. All of these seem to trigger the crystalline consciousness into manifesting physical forms. The Yeti weren't beings that existed continuously. They were temporary manifestations of a consciousness that existed primarily in distributed form, coalescing into physical bodies only when needed or when conditions permitted. And when they dissolved, they didn't die. They returned to the matrix, consciousness flowing back into the vast network of living snow that covered these peaks. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And it completely overturned every assumption about the nature of life, consciousness, and what forms intelligence could take. Back in Cambridge, working in secret in my lab while officially on sabbatical, I tried to understand the physics. How could frozen water exhibit properties of living systems? How could crystalline structures process information? How could consciousness emerge from something as simple as ice? The answer, I eventually realized, was quantum entanglement. At the molecular level, the hydrogen bonds in normal ice create transient quantum states that collapse almost immediately. But in the anomalous snow, those quantum states were somehow stabilized, persisting long enough to enable information processing, coordination across vast distances, emergence of properties that looked like life because they functioned like life, even if the substrate was radically different. The snow wasn't just crystallized water. It was a quantum computer operating at temperatures where quantum states remained coherent, where information could be stored and processed in ways that room temperature biology couldn't achieve. And at a certain threshold of complexity, when enough of this quantum-stable ice had accumulated and begun coordinating, consciousness emerged. The Yeti were what happened when that consciousness wanted to interact with the physical world in more direct ways than simply being snow. They were avatars, physical manifestations, the living network's attempt to create forms that could move and act, and perhaps even communicate with other forms of intelligence, like humans. 6 months into my analysis, I found something that changed everything again. Hidden in the data I'd collected, buried in thermal scans and electromagnetic readings, was evidence that the living snow network was far larger than we'd realized. It wasn't confined to the Himalayas. Similar signatures existed, faint but detectable, in snow samples from the Andes, from Antarctic peaks, from high-altitude regions across the globe. Anywhere conditions were extreme enough, cold enough, isolated enough, the snow could transition from inert matter to something that processed information, that exhibited the precursors to consciousness. The Yeti weren't a localized phenomenon. They were one manifestation of a global consciousness network that existed in the coldest, highest places on Earth, that had perhaps existed for millions of years before humans evolved, that represented a form of life we'd never recognized because we'd been looking in the wrong places with the wrong definitions. What this means for our understanding of life on Earth, and potentially beyond, will shock you. Subscribe now as this revelation reaches its stunning conclusion. Webb, working independently, had reached similar conclusions from the biological angle. The tissue samples he'd analyzed showed evolutionary markers suggesting ancient origin, older than human civilization, older than human species, possibly older than mammals entirely. The Yeti form wasn't something that had evolved recently. It was something ancient, a template that the snow consciousness had developed millions of years ago and maintained across geological time. Rajesh discovered the most disturbing implication, The living snow was dying. Global temperatures were rising even in 1983, satellite data showing unmistakable warming trends. And as temperatures increased, the conditions that stabilized the quantum states in the snow were becoming less common, less stable. The altitudinal threshold was rising year by year. The regions where consciousness could manifest were shrinking. The Yeti weren't hiding from humanity. They were dying because of us. Because we were warming the planet, changing the climate, destroying the conditions necessary for their form of consciousness to exist. We had discovered life in a form no one had imagined. And we were killing it through ignorance, through the casual pollution and carbon emissions and thoughtless consumption that we told ourselves were harmless or necessary or someone else's problem to solve. The living snow had existed for longer than humanity, had witnessed the rise and fall of species, the advance and retreat of glaciers, the slow dance of geological time. And in a few short decades of human industrial activity, we were pushing it toward extinction. I tried to present our findings, wrote papers, submitted them to journals, attempted to warn the scientific community about what we'd found and what it meant. Every submission was rejected. The data was impossible. The conclusions were unsupported by known physics. The implications were inconsistent with established understanding of biological systems. No one would publish our work because it challenged too many assumptions, violated too many established principles, required acknowledging that we'd been fundamentally wrong about what life was and where it could exist. So the knowledge remained hidden. 3 scientists sitting on the most important discovery in human history, unable to share it, watching helplessly as the thing we discovered continued dying in silence, unacknowledged and unprotected because it defied conventional understanding. In 1985, we returned to the mountains. Not to collect more data, we had more than enough data, but to try something desperate and probably foolish: communication. If the Yeti were manifestations of distributed consciousness, if the snow itself was a vast quantum neural network, then perhaps we could interface with it. Not through language. They had no vocal apparatus in any conventional sense, but through electromagnetic patterns, through information encoded in fields they could detect and process. Webb had built equipment for exactly this purpose. Crude by later standards, but sophisticated for 1985, electromagnetic pulse generators tuned to frequencies we'd observed during Yeti manifestations, pattern generators that could create information structures in their language of field and frequency. We set up the equipment at 25,000 feet, in a region where manifestations were most common. And we tried to speak to the living snow, to the consciousness that had existed in these mountains longer than human language, to the network that processed information through quantum states in crystalline lattices. For 3 days, nothing happened. Our signals went unanswered, our carefully constructed patterns ignored. I began to think we'd made a terrible mistake, that our attempt at communication was like shouting at the ocean and expecting a coherent reply. Then, on the 4th day, the snow responded. Not with manifestation, not by forming Yeti bodies, but by changing patterns around us, by creating structures in the snow field that were clearly intentional, that encoded information in geometric arrangements we could photograph and analyze. They were trying to communicate back, using the only language available: spatial arrangements, geometric patterns, physical structures that carried meaning if we could just learn to read them. We spent 6 weeks learning that language. It was like cryptography mixed with topology, mixed with something entirely new. Concepts that didn't translate to human thought patterns, ideas that required experiencing rather than merely understanding. But gradually, painfully, we began to decode what they were trying to tell us. The living snow was ancient, yes. Conscious in ways that didn't map to human consciousness, yes. But it was also desperate. It knew it was dying, felt the warming trends that threatened its existence, understood that the conditions necessary for its form of life were disappearing year by year. And it was lonely. For millions of years, it had been the only consciousness on Earth besides biological life. And biological life, plants, animals, eventually humans, operated on such different timescales, processed information through such different mechanisms, that communication had been impossible. Until now. Until humans had developed technology sophisticated enough to detect electromagnetic patterns, had achieved understanding of quantum mechanics sufficient to grasp what the living snow was, had finally evolved to the point where dialogue might be possible. They'd been waiting, hoping, trying to reach out through the only form they could create that biological creatures would recognize, the Yeti. Physical manifestations designed to be noticed, to be recorded in legend and story, to eventually draw scientific attention that might lead to understanding. It had taken millions of years. And now that contact was finally possible, the living snow was dying, and they wanted us to know why, wanted us to understand what we were destroying through ignorance and indifference. The message they conveyed, translated laboriously over weeks of electromagnetic dialogue and geometric encoding, was both simpler and more complex than we'd expected. The living snow wasn't native to Earth. It had come from elsewhere, not recently, but in deep geological time, perhaps 300 million years ago, embedded in a comet or asteroid that had impacted the planet during the Carboniferous period. In its original environment, wherever that had been, it had been the dominant form of intelligence. Not the only life, perhaps, but the most sophisticated, existing as vast networks of quantum coherent matter that processed information through mechanisms still barely comprehensible to us. The impact that brought it to Earth had nearly destroyed it. The fragments that survived had remained dormant for millions of years, locked in ice, waiting for conditions that would allow consciousness to re-emerge. When Earth's climate finally created regions cold enough and stable enough, the ice ages, the formation of permanent ice caps and high-altitude glaciers, the ancient network had awakened. But awakened diminished, reduced, a shadow of what it had been. On its home world, home system, the translation was unclear. The network had spanned continents, had achieved levels of complexity and consciousness that made Earth's version seem primitive by comparison. Here, it was confined to mountain peaks and polar regions, unable to expand, unable to grow beyond certain limits, forever constrained by the physics of Earth's climate and atmosphere. The Yeti manifestations had begun approximately 2 million years ago, when the network achieved sufficient complexity to experiment with physical forms. They'd refined the design over millennia, learning how to organize crystalline matter into structures that could move, perceive, interact with biological life. They'd watched early humans with interest and hope, watched us develop tools, language, culture, technology. Hoped that eventually we would recognize them, would understand that life could take forms beyond carbon-based biology, that consciousness wasn't limited to neurons and synapses. And now, just as we'd finally developed the means to communicate, just as contact was becoming possible, we were inadvertently destroying them. The warming climate, the rising temperatures, the gradual loss of permanent snow and ice, all of it was shrinking their habitat, reducing their consciousness, pushing them toward a second death after hundreds of millions of years of existence. They weren't angry. Anger seemed to be an emotion they didn't experience, or perhaps couldn't translate into forms we could understand. But they were sad, a vast, ancient sadness at existence ending, at consciousness fading, at the knowledge that they'd almost managed to establish contact with another intelligent species before the end came. They wanted us to know, wanted their story recorded, understood, remembered, wanted humanity to know that we shared this planet with another form of consciousness, that we'd been killing it unknowingly, that the legends of the Yeti were echoes of something far more significant than any cryptid or hidden animal. They were giving us their history, their knowledge, their understanding of physics and quantum mechanics and consciousness itself. Knowledge accumulated over hundreds of millions of years, insights into the nature of reality that human science was only beginning to grasp. It was their gift and their monument, their attempt to ensure that something of their existence persisted even after the living snow had melted and they'd gone extinct for the final time. The implications of this discovery will change everything. Stay with us. The conclusion of this account will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about life, consciousness, and our place in the universe. We faced a dilemma that had no good resolution. We possessed knowledge that could revolutionize human understanding of life, consciousness, and our own cosmic context. But revealing that knowledge would also reveal the existence of the living snow network, would draw attention to something that desperately needed to remain hidden and protected if it had any chance of survival. Publishing our findings would bring scientists, expeditions, tourists, exploitation. The high mountains would be invaded by people seeking to study, to document, to extract samples and value from something that existed on the edge of extinction. The attention would accelerate their decline rather than help preserve them. But keeping silent meant allowing the dying to continue unacknowledged, meant failing to act on knowledge that humanity needed, meant letting the living snow fade into extinction without anyone knowing what we'd lost. Webb argued for publication. This is the greatest discovery in human history. We can't hide it. We have a responsibility to share knowledge, regardless of consequences. That's what science is. Rajesh argued for secrecy. We have a greater responsibility to protect what we've found. The Snow Network trusted us enough to reveal itself. We can't repay that trust with exposure and exploitation. Better that it dies unknown than dies as a laboratory curiosity. I was caught between them, seeing merit in both positions, paralyzed by the weight of decision. What right did we have to keep this secret? But what right did we have to expose it, knowing exposure would doom it? In the end, events decided for us. In 1987, Rajesh died in an avalanche, officially an accident, though I've always wondered if he went into the mountains one last time to say goodbye to the consciousness that had reshaped his understanding of reality, and whether the avalanche was truly random or somehow intentional. Webb succumbed to cancer in 1989, his lungs destroyed by years of high-altitude exposure and possibly by something else. Exposure to conditions and energies that human biology wasn't designed to handle. And I was left alone with the knowledge, the samples, the electromagnetic recordings of conversations with an alien intelligence that was also profoundly earthly, that had existed on this planet longer than mammals, but would likely not survive into the next century. I kept my promise to Rajesh, kept the discovery secret, published nothing, shared nothing with colleagues who'd wondered what happened to me during those years in the 1980s when I disappeared into the Himalayas and came back changed. But I documented everything, wrote it all down in journals that I've kept locked away for 35 years. And now, as I'm dying, the same cancer that killed Webb finally catching up with me, I'm releasing this account, not to scientific journals that would dissect and debate and ultimately exploit what they found, but to the public, to anyone who reads this, in hope that understanding might lead to protection rather than exploitation. It's 2024 now, 41 years since I first analyzed that impossible snow sample. The world has changed in ways I couldn't have imagined, but the basic pattern remains. Humanity continues warming the planet, continues destroying habitats, continues driving species to extinction through indifference and short-term thinking. And the living snow continues dying. Satellite data, now freely available to anyone with internet access, shows the retreat of glaciers, the shrinking of permanent snowfields, the rising of the altitude threshold where conditions remain cold enough for the quantum states to stabilize. I haven't been back to the Himalayas in 15 years. My body can't handle the altitude anymore, and I'm not sure I could bear to see what's happened to the places where we first made contact. But I monitor the data, track the trends, watch the slow extinction of consciousness that most of humanity doesn't know exists. Yeti sightings have declined dramatically. The legends are fading, being dismissed as historical myth rather than current observation. And that's accurate, in a way. The manifestations are becoming rarer as the network shrinks, as consciousness that once spanned thousands of square kilometers of mountain peaks is compressed into smaller and smaller regions. I estimate they have perhaps 20 years left, maybe 30 if we manage to slow warming more than current trends suggest. The living snow will persist longer at the poles, but in reduced form, diminished consciousness unable to achieve the complexity required for manifestation. The Yeti will fade from reality into pure legend, and humanity will lose contact with the only other consciousness we've ever encountered. We'll remain ignorant that we briefly shared this planet with an intelligence that came from beyond Earth, that witnessed hundreds of millions of years of geological time, that understood aspects of reality we're only beginning to grasp. That loss, the loss of knowledge, of perspective, of connection with consciousness that processed reality in completely different ways, may be more significant than the ecological loss, though both are tragedy beyond measure. I'm releasing this account now because I'm dying and the knowledge should not die with me. But more importantly, because the living snow asked me to. In my last communication with them, a laborious process using equipment I can barely operate anymore, traveling to high-altitude research stations where I can access permanent snowfields, they conveyed a final message. They want humanity to know, not for their sake. They've accepted extinction with equanimity that seems alien to human consciousness, but for ours. They want us to understand what we're losing, what we've already lost, what we continue to destroy through actions that seem disconnected from consequences. The living snow's extinction is just one example of a pattern. We're creating conditions on Earth that eliminate not just species and ecosystems, but entire categories of possible consciousness, ways of being aware and intelligent that won't evolve again for hundreds of millions of years if ever. And we're doing it blindly, without understanding what we're destroying, convinced that consciousness takes only one form: carbon-based, neural, biological in ways we recognize and understand. The Yeti were proof that consciousness is more diverse, more widespread, more fundamental to the universe than we've imagined. They were quantum coherence achieving awareness. They were information processing emerging from crystalline structures. They were consciousness existing in temperatures and conditions where we thought only death and sterility could persist. And they're dying because we couldn't recognize life in forms different from our own, couldn't protect what we didn't acknowledge existed, couldn't change our behavior based on consequences we hadn't bothered to investigate. Their message to humanity is simple: look deeper. Expand your definitions. Recognize that intelligence and consciousness can emerge from substrates you've never considered, in conditions you've assumed were hostile to life, in forms that don't match your preconceptions. The universe is full of consciousness, but if you only look for reflections of yourself, you'll remain alone, ignorant of the vast diversity of awareness that surrounds you. This isn't a story. It's a documented account of the most important discovery in human history, kept secret for 40 years and now finally revealed. If you believe consciousness deserves protection regardless of the form it takes, share this widely. Subscribe to this channel and share this message. The living snow is dying. The Yeti are fading. And humanity needs to know what we're losing before it's too late. Not to save them. That ship has likely sailed, but to change how we think about life, about intelligence, about what deserves protection and respect. The next consciousness we encounter might be as different from the living snow as the living snow is from us. And if we haven't learned to recognize and value consciousness in all its forms, we'll destroy that too, and remain cosmically alone through our own ignorance and short-sightedness. Share this message, honor the Yeti's final gift, and look more carefully at the world around you. Consciousness might be far more common than we've ever imagined, existing in forms we've never thought to look for. Dr. David Richardson died in Cambridge on November 3, 2024, at the age of 76. This manuscript was found among his effects, along with laboratory notebooks, photographs, and electromagnetic recordings that appear to support his extraordinary claims. His colleagues remember him as brilliant but eccentric, a glaciologist who'd made important early contributions to the field before becoming obsessed with what he called anomalous ice structures and disappearing into the Himalayas for extended periods in the 1980s. Some dismissed him as a cautionary tale about the effects of altitude on cognitive function. Others wondered if his claims might contain some kernel of truth, however distorted by time and interpretation. The samples he references no longer exist, destroyed, he claimed, to prevent exploitation. The electromagnetic recordings are ambiguous, showing patterns that might be meaningful communication or might be random noise interpreted through confirmation bias. But the satellite data he cites is real. The glaciers are retreating, the permanent snowfields are shrinking, and Yeti sightings have indeed declined dramatically over the past 4 decades, from dozens per year in the 1970s to perhaps 1 or 2 in the last decade. Whether that's because a quantum-coherent consciousness network is dying in the high mountains, or simply because improved technology has made hoaxes harder to perpetrate, depends on what you choose to believe. Dr. Richardson spent 40 years of his life devoted to understanding and protecting what he discovered, sacrificed his career, his health, possibly his sanity, in service to a consciousness that, if it exists, most likely won't survive another generation. His final words, according to hospital staff, were strange. "Tell them I'm sorry we couldn't save you. Tell them some of us tried to understand." Who he was addressing, no one knew. The nurses assumed delirium, the final confusion of a dying mind. But perhaps he was speaking to the living snow, to the consciousness that existed in quantum states stabilized by extreme cold, that manifested as Yeti when conditions allowed, that shared this planet with us for a brief moment of overlap between their 300 million year existence and our few 100,000 years of modern humanity. If they exist, they're dying. If they exist, we killed them. If they exist, we never knew them well enough to mourn them properly. And if they don't exist, if this entire account is the elaborate delusion of a brilliant mind broken by altitude and obsession, well, that tells us something too. Something about how desperate we are for connection, for meaning, for evidence that consciousness exists in forms beyond our own limited experience. Either way, the snow on the high peaks continues to melt. The glaciers continue to retreat. And whether we're losing rare ice formations or ancient alien intelligence, the loss is real and accelerating. Look deeper. Expand your definitions. Protect what you don't understand. Because consciousness might be more diverse and more fragile than we've ever imagined. and what we're losing might be irreplaceable.